Some names are not forgotten because they were famous. They are forgotten because remembering them changes everything. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, tucked between utility bills and grocery coupons as though it belonged to an ordinary day. I almost threw it away without opening it. There was no return address, no postage stamp I recognized, only my name written in elegant blue ink that looked strangely familiar. After 12 years as a newspaper investigative reporter, I had opened thousands of anonymous letters, but something about this one made my hands hesitate. My apartment overlooked the waterfront in Boston, where late autumn rain tapped softly against the windows while ferries crossed the harbor beneath a sky the color of old steel. I had spent most of the morning trying to finish an article that refused to come together. Since my divorce 3 years earlier, work had become easier than silence. Stories always made sense. People rarely did. I poured another cup of coffee before carefully breaking the envelope seal. Inside was only a faded photograph and a single folded piece of paper. The photograph showed two young women standing beside a weathered lighthouse overlooking the ocean. One of them smiled brightly toward the camera while the other looked away, laughing at something outside the frame. The woman facing the camera looked hauntingly familiar. It took several seconds before I realized why. She was me, or at least a much younger version of me. My hair was longer. My face carried a confidence I barely recognized, and around my neck hung the silver compass necklace I had not seen in over 20 years. My heartbeat slowed as I searched the image for another clue. The second woman stood close enough that our shoulders almost touched. She had soft auburn hair dancing in the ocean wind and gentle green eyes filled with warmth. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I could not remember her name. I turned the photograph over. Written neatly across the back were only 4 words. Her name was Saraphina. My fingers tightened around the edges of the picture. The name stirred something deep inside me, like hearing the melody of a forgotten song without remembering the lyrics. I unfolded the paper tucked behind the photograph. There was only one sentence. If you truly want to remember her, come back before the first lighthouse bell rings on Saturday morning.
No signature. No explanation.
Only those words. I checked the calendar hanging beside my kitchen counter. Saturday was 4 days away. I searched my phone for any mention of Saraphina, then my old email archives, then boxes of college photographs stored inside the bedroom closet. Nothing. It was as though someone had carefully erased every trace of her from my life, while leaving behind only enough evidence to make me question my own memory. The rain outside intensified, blurring the harbor lights into soft reflections across the glass. I returned to the photograph again and noticed something I had completely missed before. Resting in my younger hand was the same leather journal I still kept locked inside my desk drawer. I had owned it for decades, yet more than half of its pages remained blank. Confused, I retrieved the journal and carefully opened the cover. A small folded note slipped onto the floor. I stared at it, certain I had never seen it before. Across the outside, written in the same elegant blue ink as the envelope, were 6 simple words that instantly sent a chill through me. Do not let Olivia leave first. The note remained in my hand long after I finished reading it. Olivia. The name meant nothing to me, yet the urgency behind those 6 words felt impossible to ignore. I searched every page of the old leather journal, hoping to find another clue, but most of it was still blank except for a pressed wildflower tucked between 2 empty pages and a faint scent of salt that somehow still lingered after all those years. I sat back in silence, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps I had simply forgotten an old college friend. Perhaps the photograph belonged to someone else's memory that had somehow become tangled with mine. But deep down, I already knew neither explanation felt true. The next morning I requested 2 vacation days from the newspaper and booked the earliest flight to a small coastal town in Maine where the lighthouse in the photograph was located. I had covered enough human interest stories over the years to recognize when an unanswered question refused to let go. This was no longer just curiosity. It felt personal. The drive from the regional airport took nearly 90 minutes along winding coastal roads lined with pine trees and rocky cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The farther I drove, the stronger the strange feeling became. Certain curves in the road seemed familiar before I reached them. A weathered white church, an old seafood market, even a faded mural painted on the side of an abandoned warehouse stirred fragments of recognition that disappeared as quickly as they arrived. By the time I reached the town square, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting warm light across brick sidewalks and small family-owned shops that looked almost untouched by time. I parked beside a modest bakery and unfolded the old photograph again. The lighthouse stood less than a mile away at the edge of the harbor. As I started walking, several people smiled politely, yet one elderly woman stopped completely when she noticed the picture in my hand. Her expression shifted from curiosity to quiet disbelief. "Where did you find that?" she asked softly. I hesitated before answering. "It was mailed to me." She looked at the photograph again, then back at my face. "You came back." Those 3 words unsettled me more than any explanation could have. "Have we met before?" I asked. The woman smiled sadly. "Long ago." Before I could ask another question, she gently touched my arm. "If you are looking for answers, go to Brooks and Tide Books before sunset." "Who owns it?" I asked. "Someone who has been waiting much longer than she expected." She walked away before I could stop her. 20 minutes later, I found the bookstore tucked between an antique shop and a small cafe overlooking the harbor. A brass bell chimed softly as I stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling shelves overflowed with novels, local history, and maritime journals, while sunlight poured through tall front windows, filling the room with golden light. Behind the counter stood a woman, arranging a display of travel books. She looked up, and the moment our eyes met, every sound inside the bookstore seemed to disappear. She was around my age, with shoulder-length chestnut hair, calm blue eyes, and an expression that shifted instantly from surprise to emotion she struggled to hide. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, she whispered my name so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. "Claire." I stared back in confusion. "Do I know you?" The woman took one slow breath before answering. "You used to." She glanced toward the photograph still resting in my hand, and tears quietly gathered in her eyes as she spoke the words that changed everything. "Saraphina asked me to give that back to you when you were finally ready to remember." Olivia's words lingered between us like an echo that refused to fade. I looked from the photograph to her face, searching for even the smallest spark of recognition, but every memory remained locked behind an invisible wall. "I do not understand," I admitted quietly. Olivia nodded as though she had expected that answer all along. She stepped out from behind the counter and carefully turned the sign on the front door from open to back soon before locking it. The bookstore suddenly became even quieter, filled only with the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock and the distant cries of seagulls drifting in through the open windows. "Come with me," she said softly. I followed her toward a reading room tucked behind rows of weathered bookshelves. The space overlooked the harbor through wide windows where fishing boats rocked gently against the docks. A small wooden table stood in the center of the room beside a fireplace that had not been lit in years. Olivia pulled a faded storage box from the bottom shelf and placed it carefully between us. She hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly tied bundles of letters, several old photographs, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, postcards, and a small seashell painted with delicate blue waves. Everything inside looked as though it had been preserved with extraordinary care. Olivia picked up the painted shell and smiled faintly. "You made this together during your first summer here." I frowned. "I have never been good at painting." "You kept saying that," Olivia replied. Saraphina insisted it did not matter, because memories were never supposed to be perfect. She handed me the shell. The instant my fingers touched its smooth surface, an unexpected image flashed across my mind. Bright sunlight, ocean wind, someone laughing beside me while dipping a tiny paintbrush into blue watercolor. The memory lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing, but it was enough to leave my pulse racing. Olivia noticed the change in my expression. "You remembered something." "Only a feeling," I whispered. "Not enough." She opened one of the bundles of letters and carefully selected an envelope addressed in the same elegant blue handwriting I had seen on the anonymous note. She wrote these over many years, Olivia explained. She never stopped believing you would come back one day. My throat tightened. If she cared so much, why did she never contact me? Olivia looked down at the envelope in silence before answering. She tried. She reached beneath the stack of letters and removed a collection of unopened envelopes, every one bearing my name and old Boston addresses where I had actually lived over the years. None had ever reached me. Some carried postal marks showing they had been returned. Others had never even been mailed. She could never decide whether finding you again would heal you or hurt you, Olivia said. Every letter became harder to send. I slowly opened the envelope she had chosen. Inside was a single handwritten page. The date at the top placed it nearly 19 years in the past. I began reading aloud. Dear Claire, if you are holding this, then somehow hope was stronger than time. I smiled despite the ache growing inside my chest. The words felt strangely familiar, almost as though I had heard them before in another life. The letter continued with ordinary memories of long walks beside the lighthouse, afternoons spent reading novels by the harbor, and quiet conversations that stretched long after sunset. Yet nowhere did it explain why I could not remember any of it. When I reached the final line, my hands began to tremble. If someday you forget me, promise me one thing. Trust Olivia before you trust your own memories. I looked up in disbelief. Before I could ask what those words meant, the brass bell above the bookstore entrance rang softly. Both of us turned toward the front of the shop. Olivia's expression changed immediately. Nobody should know you are here, she whispered. She moved toward the doorway, then suddenly stopped as a familiar female voice drifted through the shelves with quiet certainty. I believe Claire Bennett has finally come home. Olivia and I exchanged a quick glance before she walked toward the front of the bookstore with measured steps. I followed a few feet behind, still holding the letter in my hand. Standing near the entrance was an older woman wearing a light blue cardigan over a white blouse, her silver hair neatly tied back beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. She smiled warmly the moment she saw me, yet there was something unexpectedly emotional in her eyes. It really is you, she said softly. I was beginning to think I would never see this day. I searched her face, hoping another memory might surface. But once again, I found only unfamiliar features wrapped in an impossible sense of familiarity. Olivia spoke first. Claire, this is Margaret Ellis. The woman nodded politely. Most people here simply call me Maggie. She extended her hand, and when I shook it, she held on just a second longer than expected. Saraphina spoke about you almost every week. My chest tightened. You knew her well? Maggie smiled gently. She volunteered at the community library every Saturday morning. We shelved books together for nearly 15 years. She looked toward Olivia before continuing. She also believed that one day you would come back to finish something you both started. I frowned. Finish what? Maggie reached into her canvas tote bag and carefully removed a small wooden box no larger than a jewelry case. Time had softened its edges, and a tiny brass latch held the lid closed. She placed it on the counter between us. She asked me to give this to you only after you returned to the bookstore. Olivia looked surprised. You never told me about this. Maggie smiled with quiet apology. Because she asked me not to. I slowly opened the latch. Inside rested a delicate silver lighthouse charm attached to a faded blue ribbon, along with an old brass key wrapped inside a folded piece of parchment. The handwriting was unmistakable. It matched every letter I had seen since arriving in town. I unfolded the note carefully. Meet the sunrise where promises never disappear. Bring Olivia. Do not come alone. I looked up in confusion. What does this mean? Maggie pointed toward the lighthouse visible through the bookstore window. There is an old keeper's cottage behind it. Most visitors never notice it because it sits below the cliffs. Olivia quietly nodded. Saraphina restored it herself. She lived there? I asked. Olivia shook her head.
No.
She simply said it was the safest place to leave the truth. The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. I turned the brass key over in my fingers. It looked old enough to belong to another century, yet it fit naturally into my palm as though I had carried it before. Another memory flickered unexpectedly. A rainy evening. The sound of waves crashing below wooden stairs. Someone placing the same key into my hand while saying, "You will know when it is time to come back." I gasped softly as the image vanished again. Olivia immediately stepped closer. "What did you remember?" "A voice," I whispered. I still cannot see her face, but I heard her. Olivia's eyes filled with cautious hope. "That is more than yesterday." Maggie glanced toward the harbor clock visible through the front window. "If you intend to reach the cottage before sunset, you should leave now. The tide covers the lower path in less than an hour." Olivia reached for her jacket hanging beside the register without another word. I slipped the silver lighthouse charm into my pocket beside the brass key, carefully folded Saraphina's note, and looked once more at the photograph that had brought me here. For the first time since opening that mysterious envelope in Boston, I no longer felt as though I was chasing someone else's past. I felt as though the past itself was patiently waiting for me, and somewhere beyond the lighthouse, another piece of Saraphina's story was ready to remember me before I could remember her. Olivia and I left the bookstore just as the afternoon sun dipped lower over the harbor, painting the Atlantic with streaks of gold and pale blue. The narrow path leading toward the lighthouse curved along weathered cliffs where seagrass swayed gently in the cool ocean breeze. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The only sounds came from distant gulls and the steady rhythm of waves rolling against the rocks below. I kept reaching into my pocket to touch the brass key, almost afraid it might disappear if I let go. "Saraphina always walked this trail before sunrise," Olivia finally said. She claimed the ocean sounded different when nobody else was awake. I smiled faintly without knowing why. "That feels familiar." Olivia glanced toward me with quiet hope. "You used to say exactly the opposite. You said the ocean always sounded the same, but people heard different things depending on what they carried inside." The words struck me with unexpected force. Another fragment surfaced. I was sitting on a wooden bench wrapped in a thick blanket, while someone beside me laughed softly and handed me a steaming mug of coffee. The memory faded almost immediately, leaving behind only warmth and the faint scent of salt in the morning air. "She drank coffee with cinnamon," I whispered before I could stop myself. Olivia slowed her steps and looked at me in surprise. "Yes," she answered quietly. "Nobody here knew that except the two of you." We continued until the main tourist path ended and a smaller stone staircase descended toward the shoreline beneath the lighthouse cliffs. The tide had already begun rising, washing against the lower steps exactly as Maggie had warned. At the bottom stood a modest white cottage tucked into the rocks, almost invisible from above. Ivy climbed across its walls, and blue shutters framed windows that overlooked the endless Atlantic. Time seemed to move more slowly here. Olivia stopped beside the weathered front door. "I have not been inside since the day she left the key with Maggie," she admitted. I removed the brass key from my pocket. It slid into the old lock with effortless precision, and after a gentle turn, the door opened with a soft creak. The cottage smelled of cedar wood, old books, and the sea. Dust floated through warm beams of sunlight streaming across polished wooden floors that looked as though someone had cared for them until recently. Nothing appeared abandoned. A knitted blanket rested neatly across a chair beside the fireplace. Fresh wildflowers stood inside a ceramic vase on the windowsill. An old record player waited beside shelves filled with novels and journals. It felt less like entering an empty house and more like arriving moments before its owner returned home. My eyes settled on a small writing desk positioned beside the largest window. Resting at its center was another envelope with my name written in the same graceful blue handwriting. Beside it sat two porcelain coffee mugs. One still held a tiny cinnamon stick tied with faded ribbon. My breath caught. The memory from the cliff suddenly became clearer. I could not see Saraphina's face, but I remembered her placing that very mug into my hands while smiling at something I had said. Olivia gently touched the back of one chair. "This was your seat," she whispered. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 20 years earlier. The first line made my heart ache before I reached the second. Claire, if you are reading this beside Olivia, then both of you kept the promise even if neither of you remembers making it. I looked toward Olivia in confusion. Tears quietly filled her eyes before she spoke. There is something I have never told you, she said softly. The last time the three of us were together, you made me promise that if your memories ever disappeared, I would never try to force them back. You wanted love to find its own way home. The room fell completely silent after Olivia spoke those words. I lowered the letter into my lap and stared out through the cottage window where the evening sun rested just above the Atlantic, turning the water into a ribbon of shimmering gold. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the lighthouse bell rang once, its gentle sound carried inland by the
Wind.
It was strangely comforting, as though time itself had paused to let old memories find their way home. I looked back at Olivia. Why would I ever ask you to do that? She hesitated before sitting across from me, her hands folded tightly together. Because you were afraid that if someone tried to rebuild your memories too quickly, you would only remember the pain and not the joy. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting those words settle.
Pain. Joy.
Somehow both felt equally close and impossibly distant. I unfolded the rest of Saraphina's letter. The handwriting remained graceful and steady, every sentence carrying the warmth of someone who believed hope could survive even the longest silence. Claire, if today has finally arrived, then I know two things. First, Olivia kept her promise because she always does. Second, you chose to come back because your heart remembered before your mind could. I smiled through the ache growing quietly inside my chest. The letter continued with memories that felt almost alive. Saraphina described rainy afternoons spent reading novels while storms rolled across the ocean, Sunday mornings baking blueberry muffins that never looked quite right but always tasted wonderful, and long walks where the three of us imagined opening a small library overlooking the sea, a place where anyone carrying loneliness could find a story that made them feel less alone. As I read each sentence, brief flashes returned with increasing clarity. Shelves filled with books. Olivia laughing as flour covered the kitchen counter. Saraphina standing near the window with sunlight catching strands of auburn hair while she read a favorite passage aloud. None of the memories stayed long, yet each left behind an emotion so real that I no longer questioned whether they belonged to me.
They did.
They always had. Tucked inside the final page was another folded note no larger than a bookmark. I opened it carefully. If someday you cannot remember my face, remember what we wanted to build instead. Dreams survive longer than photographs. I looked around the cottage once more. Every shelf overflowed with carefully chosen novels. Every chair invited conversation. Every corner reflected kindness rather than sadness. Saraphina had not preserved this place as a monument to the past. She had protected it as a beginning waiting for the right moment. Olivia quietly stood and walked toward a built-in bookcase beside the fireplace. She gently pressed one of the carved wooden panels, revealing a hidden compartment I would never have noticed. Inside rested a rolled architectural drawing tied with a pale blue ribbon. Together we spread it across the writing desk. It showed detailed plans for a community library overlooking the cliffs, complete with reading gardens, children's rooms, local history archives, and a circular reading hall facing the ocean. In the lower corner were 3 handwritten signatures.
Seraphina Hale.
Claire Bennett. Olivia Brooks. I stared at my own signature in disbelief. We really planned all of this. Olivia nodded, tears shining softly in her eyes. Every detail. She reached into the hidden compartment once more and removed a small glass jar filled with folded pieces of paper. Saraphina asked everyone in town to write one hope for the future. I opened one at random. It read, "I hope this place reminds people that love leaves gifts, not only goodbyes." Another simply said, "Thank you for believing broken hearts can heal." As the final light of day poured through the cottage windows, I realized the journey had never been about recovering every missing memory. It had been about rediscovering the person those memories had shaped. I looked at Olivia, then at the plans spread across the desk, and for the first time in many years, the future felt brighter than the past. Outside, the lighthouse lamp slowly came alive against the darkening sky, guiding ships safely toward shore just as Saraphina had quietly guided us back to each other all along. The lighthouse remained illuminated long after darkness settled across the coastline, its steady beams sweeping over the Atlantic in quiet rhythm as Olivia and I stayed inside the cottage, surrounded by the pieces of a life I had somehow lived without remembering. We left the architectural drawings spread across the desk while opening the glass jar one folded note at a time. Every handwritten message came from someone whose life had been touched by Saraphina. A retired teacher thanked her for reopening the joy of reading after years of loneliness. A young mother wrote about bringing her daughter to story hour every Saturday morning. A fisherman simply wrote that the cottage always reminded him there was still kindness left in the world. None of the notes mentioned sadness. They spoke about hope as though Saraphina had quietly taught an entire town that healing was something people built together instead of waiting to find. Olivia smiled as she recognized the handwriting on several of the papers. She never told anyone what to write, she said. She only asked one question. What kind of place would make you feel welcome on your hardest day? I looked around the small cottage once more and realized every shelf, every chair, every carefully chosen book reflected that same question. My attention drifted toward an old record player resting beside the fireplace. A single vinyl record waited on the turntable beneath a handwritten label that simply read, "For Claire." I carefully placed the needle onto the record. Soft piano music filled the room, gentle enough to blend with the sound of waves beyond the windows. Then Seraphina's voice quietly emerged through the speakers. It was warm, calm, and unmistakably real. If you're hearing this, then you've found your way back. I closed my eyes without realizing tears had begun to form. Her voice continued, with quiet confidence. Do not be disappointed if you still cannot remember everything. We are more than our memories. We are also the choices we make after losing them. Olivia lowered her head, listening as though she had not heard the recording in years. Saraphina spoke about the dreams we once shared, about the library we hoped would become a home for anyone searching for comfort, and about trusting the future instead of fearing what could never be changed. Claire, she said softly through the old speakers, if your heart ever leads you back here, it means life has already given you another chance. Please do not spend it searching for what was lost. Spend it protecting what is still possible.
The
recording ended with the distant sound of ocean waves and quiet laughter before the room fell silent again. Neither Olivia nor I spoke for several moments. Finally, I turned toward her. She knew exactly what I would need to hear. Olivia nodded. She always understood people better than they understood themselves. My eyes drifted toward the window where the lighthouse continued its patient work across the dark sea. Another memory arrived, clearer than any before it. I saw the three of us sitting together on the cliffs beneath a sky filled with stars. Saraphina pointed toward the lighthouse and smiled. Its job is not to stop storms, she had said. Its job is to remind people where home is. This time the memory did not disappear immediately. It remained long enough for me to hear my own laughter joining hers. I opened my eyes and smiled through quiet tears. I remember that night, I whispered. Olivia looked at me with hopeful disbelief. You really do? I nodded slowly. Not every detail, just enough to know it was real. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. There was nothing hurried about the moment, only quiet understanding shared between two people whose lives had been shaped by the same extraordinary woman. Outside, the first light of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon. As the lighthouse beams slowly faded beneath the growing sunrise, I realized Saraphina had never asked us to hold on to the past forever. She had asked us to carry its kindness forward, and for the first time since opening that mysterious envelope in Boston, I believed we finally could. Morning sunlight poured through the cottage windows, filling every corner with a quiet warmth that seemed to breathe new life into the old wooden floors and shelves lined with well-loved books. Olivia opened the windows to let the fresh ocean air drift inside while I carefully gathered the architectural drawings, the letters, and the glass jar filled with handwritten hopes. For the first time since arriving in town, I no longer felt like a visitor searching for answers. I felt connected to a place that had somehow continued waiting for me without asking for anything in return. We carried everything back toward the bookstore, following the cliff path as fishing boats slowly left the harbor beneath a bright blue sky. Along the way, neighbors greeted Olivia with familiar smiles, and several of them looked at me with quiet recognition that no longer felt unsettling. Instead, it felt comforting, as though I had finally stepped back into a chapter of my own life that had remained unfinished. When we reached Brooks and Tide Books, Maggie was already waiting outside with 2 cardboard boxes filled with donated books. She smiled the moment she saw us. "I had a feeling today would be different," she said. Olivia laughed softly. "It already is." Together we carried the boxes inside, and as I arranged novels onto a display table near the front window, another unexpected memory surfaced. I remembered standing in almost the same spot years earlier, while Saraphina carefully organized children's books by color instead of alphabet. When I teased her about it, she had smiled and said that children looked for stories with their eyes before they ever read the titles. I caught myself laughing quietly at the memory. Olivia looked up immediately. "What happened?" "She organized books by color," I replied without thinking. Olivia's eyes widened before she smiled through happy tears. She did. The memory stayed with me instead of fading away. Throughout the morning, more pieces gently returned. I remembered the scent of cinnamon drifting through the bookstore every Saturday because Saraphina always baked muffins before opening. I remembered Olivia humming softly whenever she unpacked new books. I remembered the tiny brass bell above the entrance and how Saraphina insisted it sounded like an invitation instead of a notification. None of the memories arrived with pain anymore. They came quietly, like old friends finding their way home. By early afternoon, the 3 of us had cleared a corner of the bookstore to unroll the library blueprints once again. Maggie carefully adjusted her glasses while studying every page. "She dreamed much bigger than any of us realized," she whispered. Olivia nodded. She believed this town deserved a place where nobody would ever feel alone. I traced my fingertips across the detailed drawings and noticed something I had overlooked before. Hidden inside the decorative border surrounding the floor plan were dozens of tiny handwritten names. Every one belonged to someone from the community. It was not simply our dream. It had always belonged to everyone. Folded beneath the final page rested another sealed envelope addressed to both Olivia and me. We exchanged a surprised glance before opening it together. Inside was a short handwritten message. "If you have reached this page, then you have already discovered the most important truth. Love is not measured by how long someone stays. It is measured by what continues to grow after they are gone." Enclosed with the letter was a small folded document bearing the official seal of the town council. Olivia carefully unfolded it, and her hands immediately began to tremble. I leaned closer to read the heading. It was a deed transferring ownership of the old lighthouse cottage and the surrounding property into the names of Claire Bennett and Olivia Brooks, with one handwritten condition added beneath the signatures. "Keep the doors open for everyone who needs hope." Olivia and I stood quietly beside the bookstore window, reading the deed again as though the words might change if we looked away. They did not. The lighthouse cottage, the surrounding gardens, and the stretch of cliff overlooking the Atlantic now belonged to both of us, entrusted through Saraphina's final act of faith. Maggie gently folded the document and placed it back inside its envelope before smiling through tears. "She always believed the right people would arrive at the right moment," she said softly. "She simply had more patience than the rest of us." The following morning, the town seemed to wake with unexpected excitement. News of the deed spread quickly through neighbors who had known Saraphina for years, and before long people began arriving at the bookstore carrying boxes of books, folding chairs, flower pots, framed photographs, and handwritten recipes that had once belonged inside the lighthouse cottage. Nobody asked for payment or recognition. They simply wanted to help finish a dream that had quietly lived inside the community for decades. Olivia and I spent the day sorting donations while sunlight poured through the front windows. Every object carried another memory. An elderly couple delivered a rocking chair that Saraphina had restored herself one winter. A retired fisherman brought an antique globe she had once rescued from a closing school library. Even the local children arrived carrying painted seashells because someone had told them every visitor to the future library should be welcomed by color and kindness. Watching the room slowly transform, I realized that Saraphina had built something far greater than a collection of books. She had built trust that continued growing long after she was gone. During a quiet moment that afternoon, Olivia unlocked a small cabinet beneath the bookstore counter and removed an old guest register bound in faded blue cloth. She asked every visitor to write one sentence before leaving, Olivia explained. Together we turned page after page, filled with thousands of handwritten messages. Some thanked the bookstore for helping them through difficult seasons. Others described friendships that began between the shelves. One child had simply written, "This is where stories stopped feeling lonely." I smiled as another memory gently returned. I remembered standing beside Saraphina while she carefully placed the guest register on the counter for the very first time. She had looked at me with quiet excitement and said, "Someday these pages will tell a bigger story than any novel on these shelves." I laughed softly. She was right. Olivia looked at me with hopeful curiosity. "You remembered again." I nodded. This time I remembered her smile. The memory remained, clear and peaceful. There was no struggle anymore, only gratitude. As evening approached, the three of us carried several boxes to the lighthouse cottage, where neighbors had already begun cleaning the gardens overlooking the ocean. Fresh flowers lined the stone walkway, children planted lavender beside the fence, and volunteers carefully polished old wooden bookshelves inside the cottage. It no longer felt like preserving the past. It felt like preparing for the future. As the final rays of sunlight settled across the cliffs, I noticed a small brass mailbox mounted beside the cottage door. I was certain it had been empty the previous evening. Curious, I opened it and found a single white envelope resting inside. My name appeared across the front in the same elegant blue handwriting that had changed my life only days earlier. Olivia looked at me in astonishment. There cannot be another letter. Slowly, almost afraid to disturb the moment, I opened the envelope. Inside rested one final photograph. It showed Saraphina, Olivia, and me standing in front of the unfinished lighthouse cottage, each of us holding a single wooden shelf while laughing toward someone behind the camera. Across the back, she had written one last message. Home was never the place. Home was always the people who chose to keep showing up for one another. The photograph remained in my hands long after the evening sky turned deep shades of blue and silver above the Atlantic. I traced the smiling faces with my fingertips, lingering over details I had once overlooked. The unfinished bookshelves behind us, the paint stains on Olivia's sleeves, the loose strand of auburn hair blowing across Seraphina's face while she laughed toward the unseen photographer. This time the image no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a memory patiently waiting for permission to return. Olivia stood beside me without saying a word, watching the lighthouse cast its familiar beam across the dark water. Finally, she smiled. She always believed photographs were conversations that never truly ended. I folded the picture carefully and slipped it inside the leather journal that had started this journey. The next morning, the lighthouse cottage came alive before sunrise. Volunteers from every corner of town arrived carrying books, flower baskets, handcrafted furniture, and framed paintings donated by local artists. Children arranged colorful reading cushions beneath the windows while retired teachers organized shelves by subject. The small cottage slowly transformed into exactly what Saraphina had imagined years before. Watching everyone work together, I realized none of them had come because someone asked. They came because kindness has a remarkable way of multiplying when it is shared often enough. Maggie unlocked the front door shortly after 8 o'clock and handed Olivia an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "This belongs to both of you now," she said warmly. Olivia looked toward me before placing the key in my hand. "You should open the door." I hesitated for only a second before sliding the key into the restored lock. As the latch clicked softly into place, sunlight streamed through the entrance, illuminating rows of books, polished wooden tables, fresh flowers, and wide windows overlooking the ocean. The room filled almost immediately with neighbors stepping inside, smiling as though they were returning to a place they had always known. Throughout the day, people wandered from shelf to shelf sharing favorite stories, recommending novels, and quietly writing messages inside the same guest register Saraphina had started years earlier. I added my own sentence beneath the newest page. Sometimes the longest journey is simply finding your way back to yourself. Olivia read the words over my shoulder before gently adding another line beneath mine. No one should ever have to make that journey alone. I smiled at her, grateful for everything we no longer needed to explain. Late that afternoon, after the final visitors had left, we carried 2 steaming mugs of cinnamon coffee onto the cottage porch overlooking the cliffs. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath the golden light of sunset while seabirds circled above the waves. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the same ocean Saraphina had loved so deeply. "Do you think she knew this day would come?" I asked quietly. Olivia looked toward the lighthouse before answering. "I think she hoped it would." Hope was always stronger than certainty for her. I nodded slowly. Another gentle memory surfaced, clearer than ever before. I remembered Saraphina standing exactly where we sat now, smiling toward the horizon as she whispered, "Every ending is simply a place where someone else begins." This time the memory stayed. I could hear her laughter, remember the warmth of her presence, and feel the quiet peace she always carried with her. There was no sadness attached to it anymore, only gratitude. As the lighthouse lamp illuminated the coastline once again, I realized I had not returned to recover a lost chapter of my life. I had returned to discover that love can outlive memory, that kindness can become a legacy, and that the people who shape our hearts never truly disappear as long as we continue living the values they left behind. The waves rolled gently against the cliffs below while the first stars appeared above the Atlantic, and for the first time in many years, home no longer felt like a place I had lost. It felt like a future I was finally ready to embrace. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm that felt both wonderfully new and strangely familiar. Every morning Olivia unlocked the front door of the lighthouse library just before sunrise while I brewed fresh cinnamon coffee in the small kitchen overlooking the ocean. By the time the first beam of light crossed the reading room floor, neighbors had already begun arriving with books to donate, homemade pastries to share, or simply quiet smiles that needed no explanation. Children gathered around the colorful reading corner each afternoon, listening to volunteers read stories while waves rolled softly against the cliffs outside. Watching their excitement reminded me of everything Saraphina had believed books could become. They were never just pages bound together. They were bridges connecting people who might otherwise never have found one another. One rainy afternoon, a young girl wandered into the library carrying a worn backpack almost as large as she was. She hesitated near the entrance until Olivia welcomed her inside with the same warmth she offered every visitor. The little girl quietly admitted that she had never finished reading an entire novel because she always believed books were meant for smarter people. Olivia knelt beside her and smiled gently. "Stories are not exams," she said. "They are invitations." I watched the child's nervous expression slowly soften as Olivia placed a beautifully illustrated adventure novel into her hands. Something inside me stirred. Without warning, another memory returned. I saw Saraphina sitting on the cottage porch years earlier, saying almost the exact same words to a shy teenager who doubted herself. The memory flowed naturally into another. I remembered helping organize the very first children's reading afternoon, laughing as rain forced everyone indoors while Saraphina turned the storm into part of the story we were reading together. This time the memories connected instead of arriving as scattered fragments. They formed a continuous thread, gentle and complete. I no longer felt as though I was chasing the past. It was quietly finding me. That evening, after the last visitors had gone home, Olivia and I reopened the old guest register. New messages already filled several pages. One visitor thanked the library for helping her rediscover reading after losing her husband. Another simply wrote, "This place reminds me that kindness still exists." As I turned another page, a folded bookmark slipped free. I recognized the elegant blue handwriting immediately. It was another note from Saraphina, tucked between the pages years before. I unfolded it carefully. Claire, someday someone will walk through these doors carrying the same loneliness you once carried. When that happens, do not try to give them answers.
Give them hope instead.
I read the words twice before quietly passing the note to Olivia. She smiled through tears. She always seemed to know exactly what we would need, even years later. We stepped outside onto the porch, where a gentle mist drifted across the cliffs beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The lighthouse beam continued its patient circle across the Atlantic exactly as it had every night for generations. I leaned against the wooden railing and realized something unexpected. I could finally picture Saraphina's face clearly without forcing the memory. Her warm smile, the way sunlight caught her auburn hair, the calm confidence in her green eyes, all of it had returned with quiet certainty. I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered a simple thank you into the cool evening breeze. When I opened them again, Olivia was smiling at me with quiet understanding. She did not ask what I remembered because she already knew. Some memories no longer needed words. They had become part of who we were, guiding us forward just as faithfully as the lighthouse guided every traveler searching for home across the dark Atlantic waters. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter, and with each passing week the lighthouse library became more than a building overlooking the Atlantic. It became part of the heartbeat of the town. Every morning began with the familiar scent of cinnamon coffee drifting through the reading room, while the first visitors quietly wandered among the shelves before beginning their day. Children gathered after school to read beneath blankets beside the windows. Retired fishermen exchanged stories around the fireplace, and travelers often arrived by chance only to stay much longer than they intended. Watching the library grow into exactly what Saraphina had imagined filled me with a quiet sense of purpose that no newspaper headline had ever given me. One crisp Saturday morning, nearly 6 months after I first opened the mysterious envelope in Boston, Maggie arrived carrying an old wooden chest wrapped carefully in a faded quilt. She smiled as Olivia and I helped her place it on the large reading table. "I almost forgot this existed," she admitted. "The town council stored it years ago because Saraphina asked them not to open it until the library truly felt alive again." Olivia looked at me with surprised curiosity. Together we carefully lifted the heavy lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, handwritten journals from community members, children's drawings, pressed flowers, postcards from visitors around the country, and hundreds of folded notes tied together with blue ribbon. Every item represented someone whose life had been touched by the kindness that had begun inside this little cottage. Beneath everything rested a single leather portfolio addressed jointly to Olivia Brooks and Claire Bennett. I opened it slowly. Inside was one final handwritten letter from Saraphina. The paper had aged softly, but the familiar blue ink remained beautifully clear. "My dear friends, if you are reading this, then the library no longer belongs to my dream. It belongs to yours." That simple sentence brought tears to my eyes before I could continue. She wrote that buildings eventually grow old, books eventually wear out, and even memories become quieter with time, but kindness survives only when ordinary people choose to practice it every single day. She thanked Olivia for protecting hope when it would have been easier to surrender to grief. She thanked me for finding my way back even without remembering the road that once led here. Then she wrote something that made both of us smile, through tears. "If either of you ever wonders whether I am truly gone, listen carefully on the first peaceful morning after a storm."
Home always sounds the same.
I gently folded the letter, while silence settled comfortably around the room. No one needed to say anything. The message had already become part of us. That afternoon, the town celebrated the library with a simple gathering on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. Families brought homemade food. Children performed songs they had learned together, and local artists displayed paintings inspired by the lighthouse. As the sun slowly descended toward the horizon, Maggie invited everyone to write one hope for the future inside a brand new guest register that would continue beside Saraphina's original book. One by one, people stepped forward, filling page after page with dreams for future generations. When my turn came, I wrote only one sentence. "May every person who enters here leave believing tomorrow can be brighter than today." Olivia smiled before writing beneath my words. May no one who feels alone ever remain that way for long. The lighthouse lamp awakened as evening settled across the Atlantic, sending its familiar beam across the darkening water. Standing beside Olivia with the wind gently moving through our hair, I realized Saraphina had never simply left us memories. She had left us a way of living, and every smiling face gathered around the library proved that her quiet light continued reaching people far beyond the place where her own journey had ended. 1 year later, the Lighthouse Library had become the kind of place people described with affection long before they ever mentioned its name. Travelers planned detours just to spend an afternoon among its shelves. Families returned every season because they remembered how welcome they had felt the first time they stepped through its doors. Children who once hesitated to open a single book now eagerly recommended their favorites to new visitors, and every corner of the old cottage carried quiet reminders that kindness, when shared often enough, has a remarkable way of becoming tradition. I stood on the porch one peaceful spring morning watching sunlight dance across the Atlantic while Olivia arranged fresh flowers beside the reading room windows. The ocean breeze carried the familiar scent of salt, pine, and blooming wildflowers, exactly as it had on the day I first returned without understanding why. Only now the feeling inside me was completely different. The uncertainty had faded. In its place was gratitude deeper than words could easily express. I reached into the pocket of my light jacket and gently unfolded the faded photograph that had started everything. Time had softened its edges even more, yet the smiles captured within it remained untouched. I could finally remember every detail of that afternoon. Saraphina had laughed because I insisted the bookshelf leaned slightly to one side. Olivia had teased both of us for measuring everything twice before hanging a single shelf. The unseen photographer had counted to 3, but Saraphina had turned toward me just before the picture was taken, making us both laugh at the exact same moment. It was no longer someone else's memory. It was mine again. Olivia stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of cinnamon coffee and quietly handed one to me. "You are smiling," she said. I was remembering the photograph. She looked toward the ocean and smiled gently. "I think she would be happy that you remember it for the laughter instead of the goodbye." I nodded, knowing she was right. Together we watched a young family walk toward the library hand in hand while their daughter ran ahead, eager to reach the front door before her parents. As she crossed the small wooden bridge leading to the entrance, she paused to read the carved sign hanging beneath the porch roof. It simply said, "Everyone has a story worth keeping." The little girl smiled before disappearing inside. Moments later, we heard her delighted laughter echo through the reading room as volunteers welcomed another visitor into the place Saraphina had imagined so many years before. I opened the original guest register one last time and slowly turned to the very first page. There, written in Saraphina's graceful blue handwriting, was the sentence that had quietly guided everything we had built without either Olivia or me fully understanding it until now. "Leave every heart lighter than you found it." I traced the words gently before closing the book with a peaceful smile. Some stories end with answers. Others end with people choosing to become the answer someone else has been searching for. Looking around the library filled with conversation, laughter, books, music, and quiet hope, I finally understood that Saraphina had never asked us to remember her forever. She had simply asked us to keep choosing kindness, one person at a time, until it became impossible to tell where her story ended and ours began. The lighthouse continued its patient watch over the Atlantic. Ships crossed safely beneath its steady light, and the library doors remained open to everyone who needed comfort, friendship, or simply a place to begin again. As Olivia slipped her hand gently into mine and we welcomed another day together, I realized that love had never disappeared with memory. It had patiently waited inside every choice we made, every book we shared, every stranger we welcomed, and every sunrise that reminded us home is not the place where life begins or ends. Home is wherever hope is kept alive.